Hi, this is Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is Ecuador, specifically the Amazon rainforest, oil as a key export, and what economists refer to as the resource curse. So let's begin. Our objectives here, first of all, we're heading to Ecuador for the purpose of exploring the natural environment. And of course, understanding the impact of drilling in the highly sensitive Amazon is going to be very key to this particular class. Now, as we study Ecuador, oil, and the impact on rainforests, we need to look through both the lens of science and economics. And some of you have a background in economics, but not science, and some of you have a background in science and not economics. So it's going to be great for us all to come together and be able to share what we know. Now, in this lecture, we're going to cover some key background information that will help us framing our evaluation. And of course, as you know, I'm an economist and Dr. Hank is a scientist. So we're definitely coming at this from two different perspectives. And we're going to try to put it all together when we're together traveling in Ecuador. Now, we're going to discuss something that economists refer to as the resource curse. So we'll probably start by talking about that first, but we'll talk about it more when we're in Ecuador. And of course, we need to learn a little about the geography of Ecuador. We need to characterize Ecuador's economy, because certainly that's going to play a very big role in any decisions made to the production of oil. We need to talk about what economists refer to as institutional factors that shape decision making in Ecuador. So we're going to define what economists mean as institutions. We'll talk specifically about oil in Ecuador, what's the role of oil in their economy, and we'll discuss the impact that we're seeing on the indigenous people. Of course, we're going to be going into the indigenous communities, both the Kofanis and the Secoyas, and we're going to ask ourselves the question, does the resource curse exist? So let's begin then with the topic of resource curse. When we talk about resource curse, this refers to a paradox that we see for countries and regions that have an abundance of natural resources. So the resource curse is going to exist for those countries that have an overabundance of natural resources. Now, specifically, we're talking about point sources of non-renewable resources such as minerals and fuels. A lot of times we're talking about oil. Oil's not the only one, but oil is a really good example. So point sources of non-renewable resources. Minerals and fuels, for those of you that are non-scientists, are non-renewable resources. Whereas if we think about timber, timber is renewable. Depends on what kind of timber we're talking about. It might take 20 years or 50 years to grow another tree. But when we think about oil, we don't think about that as being renewable. So resource curse with respect to oil is a great example. Now, the problem here is that the countries that are subject to the resource curse tend to have less economic growth. So economic growth rates are lower than what you would expect them to be when you have this really valuable resource. And so the development outcomes that the countries have are worse. So we see worse development outcomes than when we compare it to countries that have fewer natural resources. So again, basically what we're saying is if we compare developing countries, ones that are resource rich and ones that are not resource rich, sometimes we see the resource rich countries developing at a slower rate. We don't see as high of growth rates in terms of their economy, and we have to ask the question, why is this happening? There are many reasons that we have that help to explain the resource curse. I'm not going to give you all of them, but I'm going to go through some key ones that might apply to some of the countries that you're more familiar with. The first thing that economists point to is that commodity prices can really fluctuate. So if you're a country that has an economy tied to specific economies, rather specific commodities, well, that can be problematic. So let's think about oil. Well, the price of oil can be very unstable. Sometimes it's going up, sometimes it's going down, and the range from high to low, and I'm going to show you in a moment, the range from high to low can be really, really significant. So think about what would happen if price of oil drops significantly. Well, then your economy is going to be really greatly impacted. So when price of oil is high, you got good times. When price of oil is low, then you have problems if you're an oil economy. So let's take a look at some oil prices. And what I've pulled is the OPEC oil price basket. Now, don't worry so much about literally what are we tracking here, but we're basically taking a basket of oil related commodities. There's different kinds of oil products, right? You've got refined and unrefined crude oil, etc. So this is basically tracking a basket. And what we see in 2002, whatever's in this basket is selling for 20, whereas it went as high as about, 110 back in 2011, 2012. Well, for the most recent data we have, what are we seeing? To 2013, 2014, 2015, we're seeing a rapid decline. So think about being Ecuador, having an economy tied to oil, but yet oil prices are really unstable. Sometimes they're really high and sometimes they're really low. That can cause problems for a country and, of course, the economy. A second reason for the resource curse is government mismanagement. Sometimes government mismanagement can lead to overuse of particular resources. Well, if government is mismanaging and they're overusing resources, then those resources can get depleted quickly. And again, we're talking about non-renewable resources. So if you extract too much oil, if you don't manage your oil reserves carefully, you could find that you're depleting this very valuable resource. And once it's gone, it's gone. Another thing that could be happening is that funds could get channeled into less productive uses. So you're selling oil, you're bringing in funds, but then those funds just don't get used very productively. So again, that might contribute to the more sluggish economic growth that we might see in some of these countries. This is especially true in countries where there's corruption. So imagine some of your African nations that are resource rich, and you've got very corrupt governments. That certainly applies to Ecuador as well. So corruption bleeds off resources that could be used more productively. Another explanation for the resource curse is what economists refer to as the crowding out effect. The idea here is that there's too much focus on the resource. And if there's too much focus on the resource, maybe we're focusing too much on oil in our economy, but then what happens is the other industries that we might be able to foster just don't get as well developed. You could think about it as putting all your eggs in one basket, right? So if you're an oil economy and all you do is focus on oil, well, during bad times when oil prices are low, you really want to be able to rely on your other industries. But you can't if you've not really fostered them, if they're not as well developed. Another thing we see in resource richer countries is that they're more prone to armed conflict. And of course, if you're a country that has armed conflict, think about what that's doing. It diverts productive resources away from their efficient uses, right? If you've got civil wars going on in your country, then you're going to see a lot of resources being diverted to this conflict, to the civil war, and they're not going to be used in the most productive ways. Now, the resource curse may not be universal for all resource-rich countries. I'm not trying to suggest that just because you're a resource-rich country means you're going to be subject to the resource curse. Okay? We also need to acknowledge that not all of the issues above apply in all cases. You could be a country that suffers from the resource curse, but maybe only some of the things we just talked about apply to your country. We do, however, see numerous examples of the resource curse at work. We could talk about a number of different African nations where there's resources, but there's lots of government corruption, where there's armed conflict, and yet we just are not seeing those resources put to good use. We're not seeing economic growth as it should be. There are examples in Asia, and one of my favorite examples from Southeast Asia is Burma. So you might see some Burma examples thrown in here. And Burma is a very resource wealthy country, but it's one of the poorest countries in the world. And only until recently, it was also one of the most corrupt countries, being ruled by a military junta. More on Burma later. So let's talk about the case of Ecuador specifically. Starting with the map, we see that Ecuador is this yellow country to the west, and I've got the arrow pointed, and notice that it's not a huge country. In terms of South America, it's a relatively small country, but that's where we're going to be traveling to, this small yellow country, Ecuador. And of course, we know Ecuador gets its name because it is on the equator. Now, Ecuador is a relatively poor country, and we're going to be looking at GDP data in more detail. But, and I meant to update this and I apologize, but GDP per capita in 2013 was a little over $10,000. And my bad, I'm so sorry, I meant to update that number. But what we know that tells us is that GDP per capita, which is basically a measure of income per person. So GDP per capita stands for gross domestic product. Per capita means per person. So if I take the GDP, the gross domestic product, for the entire country and I divide it by the population, that gives us on average 10,600. Now, again, be very clear, it's just an average. Some people make above, some people have, more income, others going to have less income, but it gives us a general way of comparing. One thing we can conclude in 2013 is that this statistic tells us that Ecuador was below the world average GDP per capita, which was 13,100 in 2013. So again, make sure you understand what I'm telling you, that if I took all countries, looked at gross domestic product for the world, divided by the world population, the average income per person is 13,100. So Ecuador is significantly below the world average. And you're going to get a pretty good sense of that when we're there. We're going to be in some very rural areas, and you'll see incomes are very low. Now we're going to be starting out in Quito, and Quito is a big city, and this is a beautiful view of Quito. And you see these houses that are built, and a lot of these are just apartments, built all the way up the sides of the mountains. It's a very mountainous area, very beautiful. But even looking at this view, you can see that this is not, lined with mansions on the hillside. These are not single family homes. This is going to be a very typical view. You're going to have children riding in the back of pickup trucks. The safety standards are very different than what we're used to. Take a look at kind of the area behind. That's a very typical town that we are going to be going through on the way to the Amazon. When you're shopping in some of these smaller towns, this might be, what your market looks like. This is where you'd be going to buy fruit. Typical farmland, we're going to pass a lot of that alongside of the road. We're going to be hitting Otavalo, where the indigenous craftsmen are selling their wares, and you're going to find just beautiful stuff. We're going to be in the indigenous communities where housing looks a little bit more like this. In fact, this is from one of the communities we're going to be visiting. And here's a second example. So you're going to see a lot of very low income lifestyles as we travel through Ecuador for sure. So let's move on to the geography of Ecuador and, of course, the Amazon region. On the left, you see that Ecuador is really divided into three different regions. On the west, you've got the Pacific coastal region, which you see in blue. In the middle, you see brown. That's the Andes region. And then on the right, you've got green, the Amazon region. Now compare that with the map on the right, and you see kind of, I guess, as a topology, you're going to see this mountain region. Now, we're going to be starting in the Andes region, and we're going to be going all the way across the Andes Mountains to get to the Amazon region. Now, look at this green area, and what this tells us is that the Amazon takes up a very large portion of Ecuador. It looks like approximately half of Ecuador is Amazon, right? Half of it's green. However, if we look at this bigger map of Southeast Asia, we see that Ecuador houses just a very small portion of the Amazon rainforest. So what's happening in the Amazon in Ecuador doesn't necessarily reflect what's happening in the Amazon all over, since the Amazon falls in many different countries. So not that much of the Amazon is in Ecuador, but as we said, the Amazon comprises much of Ecuador. So that's an important point that we need to understand. Now, here you see the whole world map, and one thing you notice, I've got the equator here, and you see that the equator goes right through Ecuador. So Ecuador is definitely on the equator. And for those of you in science, this is obvious. For those of you that aren't scientists, make sure you see that the dark green colors on this map are rainforests of the world. You see a lot in Southeast Asia. On the right, you see some in Africa, and on the left, you see some in South America. So rainforests are going to be located closer to the equator. Now, one important thing that I want to point out to you is the river system. While we've said that Ecuador doesn't house that much of the overall Amazon jungle, you do need to appreciate that a lot of the waters that we're going to see, a lot of the waters we're going to be in, flow all the way to the Amazon River, which flows to the Atlantic Ocean. So it's important to understand that there are many rivers that run through the Amazon. In fact, what you're going to see is that the Amazon's basically flooded rainforest, and when we're there, it's rainy season, and so it's going to be very, very wet, and the rivers are going to be bigger. And all of these rivers that we are going to see in Ecuador all lead to the Amazon jungle. All lead to the Amazon River. So the pollution that's created in Ecuador from drilling in the Amazon isn't going to stay only in Ecuador. Any pollution that contaminates the water is going to be carried away through other countries to the Amazon, etc. You get the idea. Now, I'm going to show you a few pictures so you can get a sense of the biodiversity, but you're going to be learning a whole lot more about biodiversity. And of course, we have an expert in Dr. Hank, and he's going to tell us a lot more about these species. But I do want to alert you to the fact that we're very likely to see this guy, right, the tarantula. In fact, the first time that I was in the Amazon jungle, there were tarantulas that were living, like a whole family of them, living in the thatch roof, and we sat under them every night as we ate. So be ready for possibly some tarantula sightings. I've also been fortunate to see this guy. Anacondas are in the Amazon. Normally we see them kind of sleeping on the side of the rivers. Hopefully we don't come in contact with any that are in the water, but you can get a sense of this is one reason why we're not going in the water when we're in the Amazon jungle. There are some people, you're going to see tourists that are swimming in the Amazon jungle. That is absolutely a stupid idea. But hopefully we can have some good sightings like this. There are lots of different monkeys in the Amazon, and so we'll try to see as many monkeys as we can, and we'll of course be keeping an inventory of all of these things. Hopefully we can catch a piranha so you can see one up close. However, just in the last couple of years since I've been there, Piranhas have been banned in terms of fishing. They were being overcaught. The indigenous people actually catch them and eat them. And of course, tourists were doing the same thing, so they've been overfished. So my first couple of years we could catch them. Now we're not able to. You're going to see a lot of different types of birds on the right. Those are the nests of the oropendulas, and that may not even be a species you've ever seen before. They have a beautiful call or whistle, whatever you would call it. And you see some interesting plant species on the left. On the left, we're going to see lots of that as well. Lots of birds. So bringing binoculars is always a good idea when we go to the jungle. On the left, we've got cocoa. On the right, we've got bananas. So we're going to learn a little bit more about those crops. The indigenous communities are cultivating these things, so we'll be able to learn more when we're in the indigenous communities. And of course, you're going to see all kinds of beautiful flowers that look different than what we see at home. This right here is one of my favorite areas, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to go there. This is the reproduction lake. It's actually restricted in access, so I'm not sure if I was supposed to be there, but we were taken there. It's absolutely beautiful, very quiet, but you have high rates of reproduction going on in these areas. And one year I was there and I actually saw the nose of a manatee popping up. I'm not sure I would have known what it was, but the shaman of the Siona tribe, who I'm hoping we'll be traveling with, was able to tell me. Let's move on to talk about the economy of Ecuador. This is going to be particularly important. Now, those of you that are science students, don't get too concerned. I'm not going to leave you in the dust here. We're going to go through some very basic information, but it's going to be crucial for us to think about the economy of Ecuador when we're evaluating the decisions that are being made in Ecuador. It wouldn't be fair for us to only think about the effect on the environment. We really need to be thinking about both the economy and the environment. Let's start by looking at, and again, 2013 data, the gross domestic products per capita, remember that means per person, for the different countries of South America. I've got Ecuador at the very top. So we've already talked about the GDP per capita, which is a measure of income per person. It's a kind of a proxy for income per person, is 10,600, which for that year made it ranked 115. We know at the very bottom, the world GDP per capita that year was 13,100. So we know that Ecuador's income per person, as proxied by GDP per capita, was below the world average. But is Ecuador the poorest country in South America? And the answer is no. There are certainly countries like Guyana and Paraguay, Bolivia, that are poorer. But there are also countries that are richer. Uruguay, Argentina, Suriname, Brazil, Venezuela. These are countries that are all significantly wealthier than Ecuador. Economists also tend to look at GDP growth. What we're trying to do is track if GDP went up or down and capture its growth rate. Now, the vertical axis here is capturing rate. So if I say 2, that means the economy grew at 2%. Well, look at what's happening here. You've got some reasonable growth rates. Let's look at 91 and 92 and 93, and you see growth rates around 4.5%, 5%, 4%, 3%, 2%. Those are all fairly solid. 2's a little sluggish, but you don't want a 12% growth rate. A lot of people think, oh, we want this huge economic growth rate, but the problem is if you grow too fast, then you're going to have inflation. Prices are going to be driven up, and nobody wants to have inflation. That's a bad thing. So it looks relatively okay, but then look at what happens. 1998, 1999, we see a big plummet, followed by economic growth that's positive. Do you notice here, economic growth actually became negative in the 1999 timeframe. So Ecuador really went through some big economic problems. It had some major economic woes. Having a negative economic growth rate is definitely not something you want. Then let's look at 2003, 2004. You're starting to see really high growth rates, 8% growth. That could be problematic. That can lead to inflation. So when your economy is overheating, the inflation becomes a concern. Now, what we're seeing here is hyperinflation. What I've basically got is a graph that's showing me the inflation rates. Now, inflation is telling me how much prices are going up. Look at these numbers, guys. Inflation of, let's look at 1990. Inflation is almost 50%. 1992, inflation is 60%. Look at year 2000. In 2000, inflation is 90%. That means prices are going up 50%, 60%, 90% each year. That's crazy. That's what we mean by hyperinflation. It's not normal inflation. Normal inflation might be 2.5%, 3%. Hyperinflation is definitely a horrible thing. So go back, think about what we just learned. We've got some negative growth rates in 1999. Well, look what's happening to hyperinflation. It's maximum at 1999 and year 2000. So again, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about all of the reasons for this, but I want you to understand that Ecuador has seen some really bleak economic times. This right here is capturing how much debt the country has. Now, when economists look at debt, we generally look at debt as a percentage of GDP, right? If I just gave you the number, if I said they have, $3 billion in debt, that'd be a lot, but I wouldn't really know how to evaluate it. Is it a lot? Is it a little? I don't know. But if we look at debt as a percentage of GDP, of the gross domestic product for the country, now that helps us get a better idea. So look at 1999. Again, that's when we started seeing the most extreme of hyperinflation. What do we see about the country's debt? The country's debt just about reaches 100% of gross domestic product. 100% of gross domestic product, that's a lot. Well, before that, it had been pretty high. So let's look at years 94 and 95, 96, 97, 98. Okay, it's 80%, 70%, 65%, but then it just plummets afterwards, right? So it goes way up and then finally starts to fall. So in more recent years, let's look at 2001, 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, we're seeing debt go down. And that's because the country's made a conscious effort to get their debt down. But we'll talk about some of the ways that they've done that. So again, we've seen negative economic growth, we've seen hyperinflation, and we've seen ballooning debt. Now, the graph doesn't show us most recent activity, but I want to give you a little information about what's been happening more recently. Well, Ecuador has started to take some big loans from China. In fact, they took a $6 billion loan for building the Sino-Hydro, I guess they call it Sino-Hydro, I think, but I'm going to call it the Sino-Hydro Corporation, electric power plant. So $6 billion loan to build the Sino-Hydro Corporation's hydroelectric power plant. Okay, that's a big mouthful. Now, this is a really big project, and we're going to see it. But this particular hydroelectric power plant will supply 75% of the country's power needs. And we're going to see at least one element of this project as we head to the Amazon. So that's a lot of power, right? This huge project funded by this loan from China is going to supply to 3/4 of the country the power that they need. But this is a huge amount of debt. And specifically, it's going to be 19% of the gross domestic product, total liability going to China. So $6 billion in debt is adding 19% of the gross domestic product in terms of debt. Hopefully that makes sense. In other words, this is a ton of debt, folks. This is a lot of debt to take on for this project. Now, Ecuador has not always been great when it comes to managing their credit. In fact, Ecuador has defaulted on debt twice in a 10-year period. So what do I mean when I say they defaulted on their debt? Well, think about if you default on your credit card. You just stop paying. You're not paying your bills. You can't or you won't. You're choosing not to. But Ecuador has defaulted on debt twice in only a 10-year period. That doesn't make them a very good risk. So interestingly, China's willing to give them these very big loans, even though Ecuador's credit history, if you want to think about it that way, is not very good. Now, they defaulted in 1999, and then they defaulted again in 2008. But interestingly, this was when President Correa simply refused to pay the interest payments to creditors. So 1999, let's think about that. In 1999, we know that the country's got negative economic growth and they have the most extreme of hyperinflation, right? In 1999, they're going through some pretty horrible times. But in 2008, things weren't that bad. So President Correa is simply making a choice not to pay the interest to creditors. Economic analysts say that he didn't need to default. In 1999, they probably needed to default, but that wasn't the case in 2008. They're suggesting that President Correa simply chose to default on these loans. So think about it. That'd be like you just waking up one day and saying, I don't want to pay my credit card bills. I'm just not going to, even though I can. Now, Correa holds a doctorate in economics. And he holds a doctorate in economics from a really good school, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. They've got a really good economics program. So it's not that he's just confused. It's not that he just doesn't understand. He's an economist. Now, I should tell you that Correa came to office in Ecuador in 2006. So he wasn't in office when the country defaulted in 1999. But again, we saw data that suggested really hard economic times. So he had been in office for only 2 years when he chose to default on the debt. So let's move on to talk about economic institutions. Economists refer to the idea of economic institutions. What we mean by institutions, I'm going to explain in a second, but one thing you need to understand is that they play a key role in determining the prosperity of a nation. Economists really feel that we can look at a country's prosperity level and we can often explain a lot of it because of the institutions that exist. Now, institutions are the formal and informal rules and the norms that organize social, political, and economic relations. So that's a mouthful. The formal and informal rules and the norms that organize social, political, and economic relations. In other words, they're going to shape people's incentives. And institutions are going to impact quality of life. So you could take two countries that have very different outcomes, let's say North Korea and South Korea. That's an interesting economic experiment. They used to be a unified country. They split into two countries. South Korea is capitalistic and North Korea is centrally planned with a dictatorship. The wealth levels, the income levels are drastically different. South Korea is prosperous. North Korea is not. And we can explain a lot of that by what we call institutions. All right, you get the idea. Economists generally divide institutions into three different categories. Political. And so when we're talking about political institutions, we're talking about what kind of political system do they have? Do people live in a democracy or is this communism? Again, that's going to set incentives for people and it's going to dictate quality of life. We might be asking, do people have political freedoms? Do they have the freedom to vote? Do they have the freedom to run for office? Do they have the freedom to protest against government? The second category of institutions are legal institutions. In other words, are there well-developed legal systems that protect people and their property? That would be an example of a legal institution. Finally, we have economic institutions. When we talk about economic institutions, we're asking what type of economic system do people live in? For example, do they live under capitalism, like in South Korea? Or do they live in a planned economy, like North Korea? Well, capitalism generally trumps planned economies. We've seen time and time again countries that have transitioned from planned economies to capitalism, like those countries behind the Iron Curtain. We might also be asking, what degree of economic freedom do people enjoy? Now, by economic freedom, we mean something very specific. And we also measure it. There's an index by the Heritage Foundation where they track economic freedom. Now, economic freedom refers to freedom to make economic decisions. And we're not talking about political freedoms. Right to vote, right to run for office, right to protest against your government, right to criticize government. Those are political freedoms, but economic freedoms are different. For example, freedom to invest, freedom to pursue an education, freedom to select a career, freedom to be an entrepreneur. How open is trade for the country? North Korea doesn't really trade with anyone except for maybe China. Some countries are very engaged in trade. These are all examples of things that define economic freedom, and make sure you understand that they're different from political freedoms. So as I said, the Heritage Foundation has an index where they actually measure the degree of economic freedom. So let's take a look. What I've got here is from 1995 to 2014, and I've plotted the United States in green, Ecuador in red, and then the world average in black. We see some interesting observations. In the earlier years in this graph, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, we see that Ecuador actually has economic freedoms that are above the world average. But what do you see after year 2000? After year 2000, Ecuador's economic freedom is number one, decreasing, right? We're seeing a decreasing trend, and it falls below the world average. So one concern in Ecuador is the deteriorating degree of economic freedom. Now, some rankings, again, you're looking at the green dots, that's the United States, and we're also seeing a little bit of a decline, but even with that decline in 2014, the United States was ranked number 12 in economic freedom. We're definitely not number one, we're not even in the top 10, but we're up there. Ecuador ranked 159, and that's out of, I believe, 180 countries that were ranked. So Ecuador's ranking for economic freedom is relatively low. So I pulled the data for 2017 and found that in 2017, they'd actually fallen to be the 160th freest. So they were 159, now they're 160. And yes, that was out of 180 countries that were ranked. And if we look at the rankings, Who is Ecuador near? Well, they're next to Liberia, Chad, and Afghanistan. Does that sound like good company to keep? I don't think so. We've already shown that there's been a general decline in their ranking, in the rating for over 20 years, and there's also been a general decline in their ranking. Now, the Heritage Foundation divides countries into categories. And Ecuador used to be in the category called moderately free. So people weren't, overwhelmingly free in terms of economic freedom, but they were moderately free. But their rating has fallen so low that they've moved into what we call the repressed category. Clearly, repressed does not sound good at all. You wouldn't want to be in a country where you had repressed economic freedom. But what this tells us is that Ecuadorians are experiencing a decay in their economic freedom, and economic freedom is not very high. This map right here puts all of the data onto one picture, and you see it's all color-coded. Now, across the bottom, you see the different elements of the rating. Property rights, judicial effectiveness, government integrity, I'm looking at the circles, tax burdens, government spending, fiscal health, business freedom, labor freedom, monetary freedom, trade freedom, investment freedom, financial freedom. Those are all the things that fall into this index. Now, if you look at the rating scale that's on the left, you see that the darkest green are the most free, followed by the lighter green, followed by the yellow, by the orange, and then the least free are in red. Well, look at the map. Where's Ecuador? They're in the red, right? But they're not the only country in South America that's also in the red. Ecuador's joined by Bolivia, Suriname, and Venezuela. Look at the United States. We're not in the darkest green, right? We're in the lighter green. Still pretty good with respect to economic freedom, but there are places that are more economically free. Now, historically, Ecuador was a lot more economically free, and they're losing ground. What are some of the reasons for this? Well, they're seeing decreasing investment freedom. They're seeing increased corruption. They're seeing a big expansion of public spending. And again, we've talked about these loans that they're taking from China to build the big hydroelectric power plant. They defaulted on their credit in 2008. So that's relatively recent. And again, we've already said that's not the first time. They're seeing decreasing labor freedom, decreasing trade freedom, and there are other things that we won't go into. So Ecuador is not an overwhelmingly economically free country. The second thing I want to show you is the Corruption's Perceptions Index. This is from Transparency International, and they have a measure of how corrupt countries are. And again, you see at the bottom a scale. Highly corrupt is in the darkest maroon, followed by red, then orange, and then yellow means you're least corrupt. So let's look again at South America, and you see that Ecuador is in the brighter red color. So they're on the corrupt end of the spectrum, but they're not as corrupt as other countries. So Venezuela, parts of Africa, but they do have a high rating, which is a bad thing in this index, or I guess a low rating, with respect to corruption. Low is bad in this index. Let's move on to talk about oil in Ecuador. Oil plays a very important role, and of course we're going to be in the Amazon with the goal of learning about the impact of oil drilling, which is already taking place. So we need to acknowledge that Ecuador is a country that's relatively rich in oil, without a doubt. Much of this oil, unfortunately, is located in the Amazon jungle. That leads to great controversy due to drilling. And we're going to learn more as we explore that country. Now, if we look at principal exports for oil, what do you think is at the top of the list? Well, petroleum. Note that they export both crude and refined petroleum. So they refine some of it's not refined. But number 2 is bananas. 3, shrimp. 4, flowers. And the 5th are other agricultural products. So guys, these are the top exports for the country. One thing I want you to absolutely understand then is that petroleum changes the landscape of this country's economy. If they don't have oil, their biggest export is what? Bananas. Oil is clearly the most important thing that this country exports. It's clearly the most valuable thing that they export. So I created a graph. This is export values in 2012. And again, remember that this is going to be driven by market prices, but this helps us understand the dollar value of the top 10 exports. Number 10, delivery trucks. Number 9, palm oil. Number 8, cocoa beans. Number 7, gold. Number 6, cut flowers. Number 5, refined petroleum, because we're dividing out refined and crude. Then we have processed fish, crustaceans. Number 2 is bananas. And number 1 is crude petroleum. And guys, look at the dollar values. Crude petroleum is by far bringing in the most revenue for this country when we look at their exports. So would it be surprising to see all this focus on oil in Ecuador? No, they really don't have a choice. Now, I'm not trying to defend them and what they're doing in the Amazon. I'm not trying to defend the way they're going about it. But the economist in me does appreciate that they are sitting on a very valuable resource that changes the landscape of their economy. If we look over time, we've got petroleum as a percent of total exports. Blue is crude petroleum and red is refined petroleum. So once again, we see that crude dominates oil production, right? Most of it that they're exporting is crude. They're not refining that much of it. But look at percentage of exports. In year 2000, combining crude and refined, over 40% of their total exports in dollar value is from oil. Now look at 2008. In 2008, it goes to more like what, 55, 56%. And the most recent data I have at my disposal, 2012, when I plotted that, it was somewhere around like 54%. So what does that tell us? For many years, for the most of this time since what, 2004, except for the 2009, and that's where we're seeing the global financial crisis, exports of oil reflect more than 50% of the economy's value of exports. All right, so guys, we can hate on Ecuador for what they're doing, but do we understand that without oil, Ecuador looks very, very different? In 2010, just to give you some firmer statistics, petroleum products accounted for 56% of total export earnings. Now, where were they sending oil to? The top destinations: United States, Chile, Peru, and Japan. But we're starting to see more going to China. Taking a look at this data that I've plotted for you here is really telling. Now, blue represents supply, or basically output, production, And the orange line is consumption. So what that tells us is that, number one, they're producing more than they're consuming, right? That makes sense. Blue is what they're producing and orange is what they're consuming. So do you see my red arrows? That's showing us what they're able to export. But look at what's going on. Look at the blue line again. Production's been relatively flat. And what's happening to consumption? Consumption's on the rise. So make a conclusion here. What's going to happen to the amount that they can export? If supply is flat and consumption is rising, then less gets exported, right? Are you with me there? So look at the size of my red line, my red arrow rather, and you see the difference is decreasing. Now, sorry about my phone ringing. Let's think about the situation that Ecuador finds itself in. It's a relatively poor country. It relies heavily on oil exports. And the oil available for export's not growing, and it's actually been shrinking. So think about those three things together. Ecuador's relatively poor, it relies on oil, but the amount of oil they have to export is shrinking. And remember, why is it shrinking? Because supply is relatively flat, but consumption domestically in Ecuador is growing. Less and less is available for export. Also remember, global demand for oil is growing, right? As countries like China become wealthier, demand for oil is going to go up. As the population goes up globally and as wealth goes up globally, demand for oil goes up. So what does Ecuador really want to do? What they want to do is find more oil, right? Again, remember, oil changes the landscape of their economy. I also want to remind you that oil is the only thing that keeps Ecuador from being a banana economy. Remember, number 2 export for Ecuador is bananas. So without oil, Ecuador's a banana economy. And again, I'm not telling you these things to excuse what Ecuador's done. I'm certainly not trying to justify drilling for oil in the Amazon. What I'm trying to do is create this economic lens that we're going to be looking through as we evaluate the decisions made by the country of Ecuador. Now, I will be the first to admit that they have been incredibly abusive to the environment, and I've seen it with my own eyes. These are all pictures I've taken. This right here, what you're looking at, is the Amazon, and we're going to pass areas like this. This is being cleared for oil exploration, and it's not the only place. As we drive towards the Amazon, we're going to see things like this and this. This is a big oil refinery station. Now, as oil has grown, pipelines have grown, and so we're going to see pipelines everywhere as we drive to the Amazon. There's a new road that's been put in that goes over the mountains, and it leads to the Amazon jungle. And so this makes it easier for oil workers to get to the Amazon. So I guess for the oil companies, that's a good thing. It also makes it easier to get the oil transported from the jungle. So again, it makes it easier to drill in the Amazon because of this road. It also makes it easier for tourists to get to the jungle. And so these are all things that create added sources of stress for the natural environment. So it's tourists, it's workers, and of course it's all these trucks, and of course the extraction of the oil. The pipeline follows the entire way along this road, and you're going to see it as we drive. Here's a good picture. This is what you see, and I think because they've got two tubes here, I think this is both oil and natural gas, but you're going to see this the entire way. Now, while oil brings in a lot of revenue for the country, of course, it has a very big downside in Ecuador, and a lot of people know this. And we know that the companies have not been using the best available practices. Per Selva, who's the organization, nonprofit organization that we're going to be hosted by, per Selva, the oil companies that are operating there are using technologies that are no better than what was available in 1964. They're not using the kinds of technologies and processes that we use in our country. Our country would never allow some of the things that they're seeing there. Texaco Chevron, Petro Ecuador, these are all names you're going to hear over and over again, but they're not using the best available practices. Of course, Texaco and Chevron don't operate there anymore. They've pulled out. But this is leading to air and water contamination and, of course, destruction of the rainforest. And I've seen some of this with my own eyes. For example, one year I took a group, or I guess I was with a group. This was my very first year. And we trespassed by going on to a site. And this is what we found. This is a toxic waste pit. There are many of them all over. And Selva literally tracks these. So hopefully they can tell us more about these. But what you're seeing here is a pit, and my photograph is not a good one in terms of showing you the sheer magnitude, but you're seeing just one little kind of portion of it. It was kind of like this mini lake, a pond, I guess, and it has a plastic liner, is my understanding, but very thin plastic liner. It's the toxic waste discharge that comes from the refining process. It's not covered, and so it seeps into groundwater when these liners break, and of course it contaminates the air. And by the way, guys, this is not in a remote area. Right across the street, people were living. Right across the street, children were playing. So this is not some remote area where maybe they're not going to be drinking the water. If this is contaminating groundwater, then children right across the street are being affected. Now, what you're looking at here is Selva land. Selva, with the help of a nonprofit organization called New Community Project, bought a parcel of land in the Amazon. A Chinese oil company invaded it, tore down all the trees, and this was after they had spent a lot of effort to reforest it. And what you're seeing here are toxic waste pits, just like the one I showed you in the previous picture, but they've been covered up. So Selva has been involved in a lawsuit trying to sue this Chinese oil company, and the Chinese oil company's only explanation is that it was too big of a temptation. And so Selva is like, what in the world could you possibly be talking about? I don't know what the outcome of this lawsuit is, and we'll try to find out. But there were a whole bunch of these toxic waste pits. And you see now they've got equipment because they bulldozed land and covered them all up. And I don't know if you know Danette Gibbs, Professor Gibbs. So this is Professor Gibbs. She and I were in Ecuador together with a group of faculty members. And so we went onto this property. This is Peter on the left. He's one of the big guys with Selva, him and Mariana. And you're going to meet probably both of them. But this is Halliburton. You've probably heard of Halliburton because it's an American company. And these are all of the different locations of the oil wells that coordinate with these toxic waste pits. Now, there's an added motivation here in that Ecuador's taken loans from China. Remember, I've already told you that $6 billion of funds loaned by China to Ecuador to build the Sino hydroelectric utility plant. And Ecuador is paying 7.5% interest on the loans. Now that I couldn't find myself, but this is information I got from Selva. But here's the catch. The interest is being paid in oil. The interest is being paid in oil. So the more oil there is, then what happens? More oil, easier to pay off this interest. So Chinese control 90% of the oil markets now at this point. In fact, oil exploration is being done by the Chinese. So a lot of the operations now are Chinese, and we're going to pass areas where signs are in Chinese. We're going to pass areas where they've got these kind of little planned communities full of Chinese workers. But what we're being told is that they're using pipes that are just not sturdy enough. And per Selva, 1 of 7 pipes burst. And I don't know exactly in what time period we're talking about here, but I've seen it with my own eyes. As we were driving out of the Amazon jungle one year, we saw this, and they're kind of waving to us, hey, because, we're a big group of gringos in a bus. And we're like, who are they? What are they doing? Well, this is what they're doing. This is an oil spill. Pipes have burst, and you've got an oil spill that they were there to clean up. And interestingly, I saw 2 of them during our drive, and our drive was about 4 hours, and we saw 2 oil spills. So I imagine this happens on a regular basis. Now, you already know about the Texaco Chevron lawsuit. You'll be learning a lot more about it, but you know that Texaco Chevron versus Ecuador was a major, major lawsuit, and there's still a lot of upset people in Ecuador. And as a result, you're going to see anti-Texaco Chevron graffiti everywhere. It's very, very prevalent. And we'll talk about the details of this lawsuit so you can learn more later. But this is the kind of thing you see. No a la corrupción. So, corrupción. My Spanish accent is not great, but I am reasonably conversational. So, if you get sick, I'm your girl. I can help you out. But this is the kind of thing you see all over. Chevron Texaco equals muerte. You probably know that word, right? Death. Chevron Texaco, nunca más, never more. So let's talk about new sources of oil. Well, we understand why they're looking for them. Well, unfortunately, the Amazon has proven to be a rich source of petroleum. But to find this oil, explorers must go even deeper into the Amazon. And when I say deep into the Amazon, that's much further than where we're going to be going. And they're going to areas where indigenous tribes live without any contact. And so you're going to hear us talking about the uncontacted tribes. This is the most biodiverse area in the world. And in these areas, tribes don't even use motors on boats. The environment is relatively undisturbed. So this is really a pristine environment, and that's where this new drilling is going to be taking place. So back to our map of Ecuador, and I'm looking at this green area where I've got the arrow, Parque Nacional Yasuni. This is the area in question where we're going to see more oil drilling. I also want to remind you guys that the rivers that flow into the Amazon and into the ocean are emanating from Ecuador, right? These rivers that you see that are flowing through Parque Nacional Yasuni, and I'm just going to call it Yasuni, are flowing from the Yasuni area into the Amazon River. So what happens in Ecuador has the ability to affect a lot of other countries. Now, this area that I've got circled is one key area. The ITT is estimated to have 850 million barrels of oil reserves. So this right here is part of Yasuni National Park. So 850 million barrels of oil reserves. Oil companies have been prospecting there since 1940 something. So oil companies know about this oil. They have been checking it out. They've been researching, testing. They know there's oil there. Now, the decision to drill in the Yasuni was supposed to be determined by a referendum vote. So a referendum vote means all citizens would get a say, right? So it's supposed to go to a referendum vote where all Ecuadorians can vote yes or no? Now, the reason it had to be determined by a referendum vote is because there were 650,000 signatures collected on a petition. And that was the required number. They got the required number to force a vote. So a bunch of people went out collecting names on, signatures on, basically petitions. They got enough. That should have forced a vote. But President Correa ruled out many of the signatures. Now, I don't know if some of them were fraudulent. Maybe the same person sat down and signed a whole bunch of people's names. I've not been able to determine if they were really fraudulent or if this was just President Correa being strategic. But he canceled the vote. And one of the incentives he had to cancel the vote is that it was not expected to pass. Everything I've read suggests that the Ecuadorian public was not going to vote in favor of drilling in the Yasuni. But by canceling the vote, it wasn't determined by the people. Instead, President Correa unilaterally approved drilling in the Yasuni. Now, more on this later because the story gets a little messier. I'll tell you a lot more about what's going on there, but in a different lecture. Now, take a look at the price of gas. Ecuador trades using the US dollar. So this is US dollars. A gallon of gas is $2, cheaper than in the United States. And that's for premium, or for super, I don't know, premium, yeah. So they call premium super. Extra is what we call, I think, regular. So look at the prices. Regular gas, $1.48. Super, which is our premium, $2. Well, my car uses premium, and I pay something like $2.60 something cents. And I know when you guys get a gallon of gas, you're not paying $1.48. Now, this was, I think, 3 or 4 years old, but this is not a super old picture. So the vote was expected to fail. Ecuadorians didn't want to drill in the Amazon, even though they enjoy the benefits of being in an oil economy, right? They're getting subsidized gas. And remember, gas, the primary ingredient, is petroleum. So even though Ecuadorians benefit from oil in this way, they didn't want to drill in the Yasuni. Now, there are lots of indigenous populations, and you're going to learn a little bit about some of them in Ecuador. The Huarani, the Shuars, the Achuars, the Quichua, the Siona Sequoias, the Cofanis. You're going to learn a little bit about this because we're going to be visiting the Siona Sequoias and the Cofanis. Lots of indigenous people living in the Amazon. And there's been a very big impact on the indigenous communities and in the Cayabeno where we're going to be. The oil companies are trying to buy drilling rights from these indigenous communities. So per Delio, who's the shaman of the Siona Sequoias, he suggested that they're offering pennies on the dollar relative to the value of oil. When I was there the first time, Delio said that communities were being offered, or tribes were being offered, $200,000. Now that's a lot of money to the Cofanis or the Sionas, but do you think $200,000 comes even close to covering the damage that would be done? Does it even come close to the dollar value of the oil that would be extracted? Definitely not. Now, Salva suggests that this is unconstitutional, that it's unconstitutional for oil companies to go into the Amazon and offer to buy the drilling rights from the indigenous tribes. And they're definitely taking advantage of these indigenous tribes who definitely don't have much resources. But again, I've tried to research this constitutionality. It's not as clear cut as I think Silva's making it, but nevertheless, there's some certain constitutionality issues. Now, here's Delio. He's the shaman of the Sionas. This is a typical house in the Siona community. They rely on the river. You can see that they're bathing in the river. They're washing dishes. They wash clothes. The river is life. It's very important to them. They use water from the river to irrigate their crops. But of course, now as the environment has become a lot more contaminated, They're having to use rainwater collection systems, and this is not something they had to worry about in the past. So what we have here is a trade-off. Oil brings in huge revenues to this poor country, and I certainly wouldn't want to, disregard that fact. That's really key. Remember that oil keeps Ecuador from being a banana economy. But this is a country that also houses one of the world's most valuable resources, the Amazon jungle. So you really kind of have this conundrum. Oil revenues benefit Ecuadorians for sure, right? The more money they have in Ecuador, they can build schools, they get health care, they better, have better retirement, social security types of benefits. Oil benefits Ecuadorians, but the Amazon benefits everybody, right? And these are things we're going to be talking about in this class. Yet Ecuador doesn't have the resources needed to protect the Amazon on their own, right? Think about the problem with the rainforests. They're located in some of the poorest countries in the world. So how does Ecuador, a relatively poor country, have the resources to protect the Amazon? Well, they don't necessarily. Possibly we have an interesting lesson here when we think about short run versus long run. What might benefit Ecuador in the short run, taking the oil, extracting the oil, may not benefit them in the long run. This is something we'll talk more about. But regardless, whatever Ecuador's decision is, there's a trade-off, right? Leave the oil in the ground, give up revenue. Extract the oil, cause environmental damage. Again, it's not an easy answer. So again, I bring you back to the very first thing we talked about. Is this the resource curse? Do we think we see the resource curse in Ecuador? Think about that a little more. You might be asked to reflect on this at some point while we're traveling. Anyway, thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please drop me an email, contact me in any way, and we're going to be moving on to talk about other economic related topics.